powered by Riverside FM.
Hi everyone. In this episode, my guest is Dr. Awais Aftab. He's a psychiatrist in Cleveland, Ohio, and an assistant professor of psychiatry at Case Western Reserve University. His research interests are philosophy of psychiatry, psychopharmacology, psychiatric classification, and history of psychiatry. He recently published a book, Conversations in Critical Psychiatry, where he gathered interviews he made with prominent scholars who are working in the psychiatry, psychopathology realm. And it's the first time that I'm interviewing a psychiatrist in the show, and I'm super excited. I've been following your blog, Psychiatry at the Margins, for some time, and it's been very informative and refreshing read for me. So thank you for accepting my invitation to join in for this episode.
Yeah, thank you, Rana. Thanks for inviting me.
So first, I would like to talk about a bit about your background. So you received your bachelor's degree in Lahore in Pakistan in medicine, and I believe specifically in surgery, correct me if I'm wrong, and went on to psychiatry residency in the US. Was psychiatry your goal when you first started your medical training, or did it evolve over time?
I'm from Pakistan originally. That's where where I was born, where I grew up, did my medical school, and the medical school in Pakistan, the degree that is confirmed, that is considered MD equivalent to the US, is called MBBS. It's just kind of how they word it. So bachelor's of kind of medicine and surgery. While I was in med school, I was one of those people who knew pretty early on in med school that they wanted to do psychiatry. And the reason was that before starting med school, I had a very strong interest in philosophy and psychology. So I was reading a lot of philosophy on my own. I was reading a lot of psychology. All really fascinated me. And there was even a moment when I was considering whether I should go into philosophy professionally as an kind of as an academic endeavor. But in Pakistan, philosophy as an academic discipline is extremely rudimentary. Not a lot of viable paths available there, and there are a lot of physicians in my family. My older sister is a physician too. I have several uncles, and so medicine seemed like a natural alternative, and under those circumstances, I ended up in med school. And I realized pretty quickly that my given my temperaments and given my interests, psychiatry was the best fit. And so I started thinking along those lines. The challenge I encountered was psychiatry was still relatively underdeveloped as a discipline, as a medical discipline in Pakistan when I was in med school. And there was a lot of stigma around it. People didn't understand the nature of mental illness very well, and there were a lot of stereotypical ideas about psychiatrists. There were misconceptions. A lot of people thought that if you worked with individuals with mental illness long enough, then you yourself are susceptible to experiencing mental illness. There was a general impression that if you're an academically bright medical student, then you would usually go into medicine or surgery, and psychiatry, with reserved for people who had relatively less academic success. And so my family was not particularly happy with my decision about going into psychiatry. I faced a lot of resistance from them, and it made me question myself for a bit too. For a while, I was thinking about maybe I should do neurology or maybe I should do radiology. But eventually, I realized that if people like me didn't go into the field, then how would things change? And I also gained a lot of clarity that I would not really be happy working in any other medical specialty. That if I wanted to do a good job, wanted to be a good physician, I needed to go into psychiatry. So I made that decision. I went for it. I'm fortunate that I was able to get to US for further training, and I'm really happy that that I became a psychiatrist because I love what I do, and it offers endless intellectual stimulation for me.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And in Pakistan, is the stigma is because of like the general culture that involves sort of these religious thoughts revolving around mental illness?
I think it's for a variety of reasons. Again, things have changed a lot. I was in medical school approximately from around 2005 to 2010. Med schools are 5 years in Pakistan, and around that time, I think access to mental health care was still very limited. A lot of people just couldn't afford to go see a psychiatrist or afford to get regular psychotherapy. The idea of psychotherapy was also relatively alien to a lot of people. The idea that hey, you could sit with a stranger and talk about these really intimate struggles was a culturally alien concept. And then there were just a lot of general misperceptions about the more severe states of mania and psychosis, ideas about possession by spirits or black magic, etc. So I think it was a combination of ignorance, poverty, superstitions. In fact, I remember I when I was in med school, I had an opportunity to visit my ancestral village with my father. And in one of the houses that I went there, there was an individual who was clearly in some kind of psychotic state. He had been tied to a tree there by the family because they had no access to medical care at all, and they also had a very limited understanding of what psychosis is or what it means, and they just were at their wits end and didn't know how else to manage the situation. And that kind of situation is not unusual or exceptional in these rural areas in Pakistan, South Asia, the rest of the world either. It was eye-opening for me to see that kind of what happens to the care of individuals' mental illness when we are looking at extreme poverty and when we're looking at lack of medical education and access to medical care.
So going back to your story, like how did you make the decision to go to the U.S. and were there any challenges along the way in your transition from Pakistan to the U.S.? I'm also so I was raised in Turkey as well, so I also moved to Belgium for the PhD, and I was wondering your experience of this like cultural change and a new system. Um,
Yeah, the decision was motivated by a number of factors. One was that the quality of psychiatric training and medical training in general, postgraduate medical training in Pakistan was not that great, and there was the general idea that if you wanted to get really good training, then US is one of the places to go to. So the one of the main motivation was simply to get the best available training that I could. Um, in terms of career opportunities too, there was at that time there were a lot of problems in the healthcare system in the Pakistan as well. Right around the time when I was graduating from medical school, there were nationwide strikes happening in Pakistan because physicians were demanding better working conditions and
mhm.
better pay and those things. So that left an impression to me about a chaotic state of affairs and uncertainty about what practice of healthcare is going to be. Uh, I was in a relationship at that time, and I think we got engaged shortly after I graduated medical school. But my partner, she was also thinking about going to US for psychiatric training as well, and that kind of solidified my decision. And then personally, for me, there were social cultural factors to consider too. I had always been more liberal and progressive in my thinking in terms of the values that I kind of looked up to. And I always felt at odds with the society around me in Pakistan, which is very traditional, very religious, very patriarchal, and I just never fit in. And at times, this resulted in various kinds of clashes with ideological clashes with other people. So I was also hoping to move to sociocultural setting where I would be less at odds in terms of values. So US seemed like a good choice at the time. Although given the recent political developments, it makes you think whether it was the best move. But at that time, it seemed like a good sensible decision. I did run into some difficulties in getting the U.S. visa on time in order to kind of do my rotation there and give some of my exams. So there's this thing called administrative clearance or security clearance, where if you apply for visa to go to US and your visa goes into this administrative security clearance thing, it's a limbo where you have no idea how long it's going to take for the government to process. And so first time, actually the first time I applied for my US visa, it was rejected. And the second time I applied, it went into this processing thing, which generated a lot of, uncertainty. And so it ended up taking 9 months to do that. And while that was happening and I wasn't sure what the situation was going to be, I ended up starting a psychiatry training program in Doha, Qatar. And so for nearly a year, I did psychiatric training in Doha, Qatar, and then when the visa issues got resolved and I got accepted in a program there, I moved to the US. There was definitely a period of some adjustment, very kind of new country, different culture, different customs. But fortunately, I had a really good group of friends. The friends who I did my psychiatry residency with, we got along very well. They were all really supportive, and my wife was already there. Unfortunately, she did not have any of the visa issues that I did when in trying to move there. And so all in all, I think the move to and getting started in the US turned out to be rather smooth, and I kind of enjoyed that process.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's an issue with most of the countries around Middle East that who have these like visa issues. So I'm really familiar with the challenges that you had. Uh, Going back to your experience, like before your residency in the US and Pakistan, so because you mentioned that you were also exposed to the factors that come into play when you are working with people who have like psychopathology, like cultural or societal issues. So I was wondering if now in your work you also talk about like how politics, religious views, societal issues shape the human condition. So you really try to contextualize psychopathology as well. And I'm curious about like how your interest in especially in this area came about, and whether that experience also was something that contributed to your interest in this.
I can't say I have devoted a lot of academic or research attention to this subject. The intersection of culture, society, and it's kind of psychopathology, especially the expression of psychopathology. It's informed by clinical work certainly, and this is an area where I personally remain very very interested. Having seen different expressions of psychopathology in Pakistan and in Doha and in US and even in the different parts of the US. So I'm very mindful of that, and this is something that I incorporate in clinical work in my teaching. But it has indirectly informed the economic work that I do. So a lot of the work that I've done in this area has been in what is known as philosophy of psychiatry, or kind of conceptual issues in psychiatry. And particularly when it comes to the nature of judgments of mental illness or judgments of mental disorder, I have been much more attuned to the role of social judgments and social cultural judgments, and in particular, the manner in which different cultures tag different behaviors as being undesirable, as unwanted, as targets for clinical attention. So that is, I think, one area where my own personal experiences and my own personal observations of having seen, how societies approach mental health issues, and how different societies demarcate different areas as deserving of mental health treatment has affected my academic work in the with regards to judgments of mental illness and mental disorder. And kind of so I lean in my philosophical work in that area. I lean towards the view that is known as social constructionism, or normativism. That these are primarily complex value judgments and complex pragmatic judgments that we make in a given social cultural context.
Okay, I see. And also, like you, as I mentioned before, you're also actively and consistently writing a blog on these topics. And there's like I think that a vast range of topics that you're interested in. So I was wondering, like, first of all, how do you find the time to dive into these big topics and write papers on them,
Yeah.
or like even blogs along with your clinical work? And second, so among these, what are the hot topics that you're working on, interested in right now?
Yeah, yeah, and thank you for your kind words. And I think it might be helpful for me to kind of go back a little bit and talk about how things developed during my psychiatry residency. And so psychiatry residency is 4 years in the US, and then people can do additional fellowship if they want. And I did an additional fellowship in geriatric psychiatry, which was another 1 year. The Because I had been interested in philosophy before I started med school, I had kept up with my philosophical interest during med school, and as I thought about psychiatry, and as I got interested in psychiatry, I started reading about a lot of the philosophical literature that existed around psychiatry at the time, and I discovered the anti-psychiatry movement. Discovered the work of Thomas Szasz. There's a British psychiatrist, R.D. Laing, who is also considered one of the classic anti-psychiatrists. He was writing about an analysis of schizophrenia and psychotic states from an existential perspective. Especially his first book, The Divided Self, had a huge influence on me. And I was reading and getting exposed to these ideas, and wondering about them. I was really fortunate that one of the books that I read at that point in my career, before I started psychiatric residency, was a book by the philosopher and psychologist Derek Bolton, and it's called "What Is Mental Disorder?" And it was published by Oxford University Press, I think in 2008, or around that time. And that book opened a whole new world, because it's a really beautiful, rich philosophical analysis of all questions around what is mental disorder, what are the nature of these judgments do we make, what is clinical significance, what are different goals of classification. And so that book caught my attention, and showed me how rich and beautiful philosophical thinking around psychiatry could be. And because I read that book, prior to my psychiatry residency, I think it helped me get a philosophical clarity around some of these basic foundational issues that I thought was generally lacking in many of my other colleagues in the profession, or many of my fellow psychiatry trainees, and even many working clinicians. I kept up with the philosophical literature during my psychiatry residency, reading more and more philosophical work and literature. There's an organization called Association for the Advancement of Philosophy and Psychiatry. They also host an annual award called the Carl Jaspers Award for the best unpublished paper in philosophy and psychiatry that is written by a trainee. And in my final year of psychiatry residency, I ended up submitting for that competition, submitted an essay for that, and I was really fortunate that I ended up winning. that year. And that allowed me to get more connected with people in the organization and get to know some of them more things. And that proved to be really helpful for me in the early stages of my career beyond residency, in further solidifying my interest and works in the academic area. Another thing that happened around the same time was that I regained my interest in some of these critical psychiatry issues, quote unquote, anti-psychiatry issues around psychiatry, and there had been a resurgence of academic interest around these things, but also popular interest around some of these more significant critical issues. And so I started reading about the movement that was being described as critical psychiatry. And what struck me was that the critical psychiatry literature was trying to tackle a lot of the same kind of issue as the academic philosophy of psychiatry literature. But there was relatively little crosstalk between the two. And I thought that many of these thorny controversies that seemed very entrenched and that seemed very polarized could be dissolved or could be made more kind of tractable if we took a philosophical attitude towards them. And that motivated my interview series that I did for Psychiatric Times, called Conversation in Critical Psychiatry. I was still a psychiatry fellow when I started that. I was about 6 months left in my training. And I started I was in San Diego at the time, and another person who was in San Diego at the time was Alan Francis, who was the chairman task force for DSM-4. And then he later on emerged as a big critic of DSM-5, and he wrote a book called Saving Normal, which was a big hit in the US and internationally. So I was fortunate that I had access to Alan Francis, and he was very gracious that he agreed to participate in this, and he has been a wonderful mentor ever since. So the interview series started with Alan Francis, and then it kind of moved on to a number of other people. The second one was Anne Harrington, the historian who wrote Mind Fixers, and it continued on after I finished my training, for another 3 years approximately. And that was also a really big boost for me early in my career, because I was just out of training, but I was actively talking about these issues. I was reaching out to these people and having these really kind of meaningful discussions. And so I think these two things in parallel, being involved with Association for the Advancement of Philosophy and Psychiatry, being connected with people who had written and done really excellent academic work in philosophy of psychiatry and knew what they were talking about, and then having these relatively more public facing, clinician facing debates, conversations, and interviews, which also allowed me to learn a lot of things very, very quickly, and also allowed me to develop my own ideas at a relatively rapid pace, because I'm getting exposed to so many things and I have to make up my own mind. And also facilitated, I think, a mode of critical engagement. And I was really interested in how do we bring philosophy of psychiatry to psychiatry trainees, because from my own experience, I had seen that there are these really rich academic discussions taking place in journals and books, but none of psychiatry trainees for the most part are just not getting exposed to them. They have no idea that these high level debates are taking place. So when I was a chief resident during my secondary training, I piloted a course on philosophy of psychiatry that I taught there myself, and then afterwards I continued a version of that through and it kind of I developed it over the years. But I ended up developing and using this framework called conceptual competence. And the idea is that just as we expect clinicians to be competent with regards to clinical issues, we expect them to be competent with regards to cultural differences. And so we argue that similarly, trainees should also be expected to meet a certain minimum of conceptual competence, a basic understanding of what the foundational concepts in the field are, what the controversies and issues around, what are the implicit assumptions that are guiding clinical work and research work, and how we can use existing literature to think more productively about those issues, and how can we adopt an attitude of intellectual humility towards these big thick concepts in the field.
Okay, I see. But it's really inspirational that you had this interest in philosophy during your bachelor's in your medical training in Pakistan, and then you bring it with you to the US and then integrate a program into the clinical training in the US, and keeping this interest going. So it's really yeah,
Yeah.
it's really
Okay,
inspirational.
yeah, it wasn't easy. Particularly, I think my biggest disadvantage here was that I don't have a formal philosophy background. So I'm essentially self-taught, which which means that there's going to be gaps in my education and understanding. But so developing a basic philosophical understanding enough that I could converse with other philosophers and I could, have some kind of meaningful dialogue with them and meaningfully engage with them in academic work. That was, I think, a difficult task. And I think this is where a lot of clinicians struggle, is that, since many clinicians don't have philosophy training and they don't have the skills to pick up what the philosophical literature is about, they are often disconnected from these philosophical discussions. And I think philosophy of psychiatry is one of those fields where people are invested in trying to bring in clinicians into the fold, where there's a general sentiment that we want a dialogue between clinicians, researchers, philosophers, and psychologists, all that, etc. And we don't want to exclude people from different backgrounds. So Association for the Advancement of Philosophy of Psychiatry makes intentional efforts to try to promote philosophy among clinicians. The journal Philosophy, Psychiatry, and Psychology, it makes serious efforts to try to include clinicians at various stages. So, for example, when we are sending manuscripts out for peer review, we try to have a clinician reviewer, and we try to have a philosopher reviewer. When we are soliciting commentaries on philosophy papers, we try to have clinician commentators and philosophy commentators. So we try to, the goal has been to build a community where these dialogues between clinicians, researchers, and philosophers can take place. And I have directly benefited from the efforts of people who preceded me in this space, and I hope to continue that as well.
And I think it's also nice that like this critical psychiatry perspective or like the philosophy of psychiatry was also appreciated from the clinicians, because in my, I don't know if it's a common common judgment that psychiatrists have this more like medical view towards psychopathology, and that sometimes you also probably like criticize some of the practices as well. But also, it's nice that it was appreciated to some extent from the clinicians as well. Or
Yes, I
would
I
you
am
agree?
fortunate. I was, in many ways, I was surprised by the reception of the interview series that we did, Conversation in Critical Psychiatry. By and large, people were very interested in it and very supportive of it, and found it very intellectually stimulating. Part of it, I think, was that it just came at the right cultural and professional moment, because we had, when DSM-5 came out in 2013, it was preceded by a huge amount of controversy and all kinds of debates around psychiatric diagnosis and classification. Other things came to a head, and there was a and in the years that followed the release of DSM-5, there was a general sense in the profession that the DSM project was faltering, that this way of categorizing and thinking about mental illness, it may be very practically useful. It may provide clinicians with a guiding schema. It may help, guide treatment, but it really did not tell us about the nature of psychopathology, did not tell us about how psychopathology is really structured, or what the mechanisms are like, and then it relying on that kind of categorical schema has many undesirable consequences in both clinical practice and research. So there was a general sense of frustration in the field with the diagnostic manuals, but it was unclear what the next step is going to look like. That what direction should the field go into? And on the research side, people were just beginning to talk about complex dynamic systems and dimensional approaches to classification. So this HIDOP were just beginning to get kind of established. And on the I think on the public side, there had been, especially in the Western world, there had been a tremendous increase in the number of people who had sought out diagnosis, who had gotten some form of mental health treatment, often not even from psychiatrists, but from primary care doctors, family docs, etc. The number of people getting counseling or psychotherapy had exploded. And so a big chunk of population, perhaps 1 in 5, 1 in 4 in US, had some kind of contact with the mental health care system. And they were now suddenly interested in understanding their own problems better too. Because especially the more educated ones, the ones who were attuned to what is happening in the field, were beginning to ask, what do I have, and how do I best understand it? And if, for example, if DSM is not the right way to understand my own problem, then what is? So the all the controversy around the development of DSM-5 had trickled down to the public too. And people who had been fed a certain narrative, they had just been told to think of, in diagnostic terms like depression, schizophrenia, bipolar, and they were just been told to think of this as, chemical imbalances or brain disorders or everything. And so as the public realizes that that story is falling apart, there's a huge amount of interest in the public too in having these discussions. So I think when my series came out in Psychiatric Times, I think it was able to speak to that sense of curiosity and confusion among both clinicians and the public, and people were hungry to for these kinds of dialogues and these kinds of conversations. So I think, and what my thing, the strategy I took was that I was wary of extreme claims. So kind of more extreme positions which simply denied that psychopathology even exists. So extreme Zazian positions that mental illness is a myth. I was wary of those kinds of ideas, and I wanted even the philosophical discussions to be presented in a manner that they would be somewhat acceptable and digestible to clinicians, that they would not be immediately put off by them. So part of the challenge was, how do we talk about these things so that clinicians can see the relevance to their own work, rather than just see them as these abstract debates that are taking place that are hostile to the profession, and that so that clinicians don't immediately react in a very defensive kind of manner and close off their mind to them. And finding that balance was among the more kind of trickier things, and and that I have carried that spirit in much of the I think clinician facing, public facing writing that I've been doing through my articles, through my blogs, is that the goal has been to not be unnecessarily divisive, not be polarizing, not be alienating just to just for the sake of it, but rather have thoughtful discussions and conversations, and trying to figure out a way of thinking about these things that that people in the field can relate to.
Yeah, yeah, I see. And so it's gonna be a completely different topic than the things that we've been talking about. Who is Awais Aftab outside his clinical and academic work? Like if you had a free day with no responsibilities, how would you spend it?
I don't know if I am, I'm really, unusual. So actually, interested. I'm a pretty, I think, laid back kind of person. I do enjoy a lot of nonfiction that is not related to, psychiatry or psychology. So I'll read nonfiction pretty widely. I also really like fantasy and sci-fi books. So oftentimes when I'm just trying to relax, I would read a sci-fi book or listen to an audiobook, and sci-fi fantasies. So I enjoy those. I watched, I enjoy TV shows and movies like most people. I love talking with friends. Sometimes just meeting a friend over coffee, over lunch, and just having long, detailed chats with them, really boosts my spirit, and one of those things I really enjoy. So that's a good conversation is something I really look forward to. And then I'm married, I have two small kids, and I really love spending time with my family too, and watching the kids play, or
Yeah,
in
yeah,
other kind of activities. And
yeah. But
so
it's really nice that you're also reading outside of your work and reading, like because for me, I'm also a PhD student, so I'm yeah, most of my time during my work hours is about reading, and when I go back to home, it feels also like work when I'm reading, although if it's not about psychology or anything. So I think it's a passion that you have about reading.
yes, yeah, and I think one of the things that can happen in academic field is that because we're reading, so much of the work involves reading, that we can forget the simple joy of reading that is not for work purposes and not oriented towards that. And making an effort to try to preserve that is important in my view, because I think a lot of it went into academic because that was an enjoyable activity for us, and some and habit we had. And if it's a tragedy if people lose their ability to read for pleasure, because of how immersed they
True.
are in academic work.
Yeah, yeah, true. And my last question is, so when people think back on your work and your life, how do you hope they'll remember you?
I,
That's a good question.
I think it's probably, it's hard for me to say because I'm still kind of early to mid in my career, and who knows how this, the legacy will be written or shaped. But I would hope that people saw me as an advocate for conceptual humility and pluralism in psychiatry, and as someone who facilitated um, thinking in more thoughtful and nuanced ways about these controversial issues in psychiatry, and someone who helped challenge some of the polarizing tendencies that characterize debates around psychiatry.
Yeah, yeah. And I think you're doing that really well,
Yeah, thank
in
you.
my humble opinion. All right, it was a really enjoyable conversation for me. Thank you so much again for joining, and I learned a lot about the issues in psychiatry, how you got involved into this field. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks again for having me. I enjoyed this.